Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining. Good morning. This is Matt Gayer, co-executive director of the Catalog for Philanthropy. We're talking about board culture and how to shift board culture today. We're going to give everyone just one more minute here to hop on the line, just one more minute, and then we'll get started. Thank you. All right, we're going to go ahead and get started. For those of y'all that just hopped on, my name is Matt Gayer, co-executive director of the Catalog for Philanthropy. We're talking about board culture today and how to drive board engagement and shift that culture if we need to. A couple of housekeeping things. You should be able to see our screen right now, hear our audio. If you have issues with either today, just let us know. We'll try to address those as quickly as we can. If you have any questions throughout today, feel free to ask those at any time. We'll answer those questions as they come up or at the end of the webinar today. And we will send out a copy of the slides and recording shortly afterwards. So you will receive a copy of the slides and recording shortly after the webinar today. So when we think about board culture, and why we might need to shift it, we know that for many organizations, board engagement is a challenge, right? That's kind of an evergreen issue that we hear even more about right now, given all that's happened over the past 2 years and all that's been expected of boards and how boards have operated for the past couple of years. But we know that at any time, boards are a vital resource, right? It is rare you see an organization grow and kind of stay on a growth trajectory, really be sustainable and stable without getting this kind of board question, board challenge right at some point. So how do we do that? How do we shift our culture if we don't have the board atmosphere engagement we currently want? And that's what we'll dive into today. A couple of things for context as we begin to talk about boards today. We know that right now a lot of organizations are really thinking about their strategy, right? Coming out of the pandemic, thinking about what do I keep doing virtually, what do I not, what new programs do I keep, what new programs do I stop, how do I keep this expanded audience, how do I re-engage my old audience, all these kind of strategic choices. And the board's going to be really integral in those and improving that direction of the organization. We know right now, while that's true, and also while timely decisions are going to still have to be made, as they were for the last couple of years, fighting against those two things is the fact that our boards have never been less engaged, generally speaking, because of the fact that we maybe haven't met in person for multiple years at this point, or at least not in person on a routine basis, right? So we've seen that affect engagement. Board members, like all of us, are just tired, have a lot going on, right? Have a lot of competing demands. And it's been difficult in this virtual space to always connect the same way with board members and remind them about why they care about the work. Also, board members are donors and volunteers, right? So we need to keep them engaged, keep them reminding themselves about why they care about what they do. And that's been more of a challenge as of late, and always a challenge even before now. So with that context, what are some kind of concrete tips for how to shift our board culture and drive engagement? We'll go through 6 of these today. And the first is really about, as we get new board members, how do we do so in a way that's going to drive engagement from the get-go, right? This is the same with staff, right? Volunteers, pretty much anyone we bring on in any role. The best way to kind of have a long-term engaged staff member, right, we all know, is to get them off the ground running, right, as they're a new staff person. It's hard if you hire someone, the first 6 months don't go that well, they're not that engaged, to then re-engage them, right? This is the same with board members, if not even more so. Because board members, sometimes their participation early on is kind of episodic. They probably don't have a project to work on, so they're just going to a meeting or two or a phone call or two. If that onboarding process isn't really strong, they can easily go 3, 6, 12 months without really doing much. And by that point, they've defined for themselves their relationship with the organization, as being one that they're not very engaged with, right? And it's really hard to then shift that dynamic later. So we really have to think about how can we use onboarding to make sure that from the very beginning, new board members are engaged, regardless of where our old board members are at. So some of the things to do there for onboarding, starting it right away with kind of a celebration that they got in, right? Making sure that at least over email, people are congratulating them, welcoming them, that they feel like there's some excitement for them to be in the space. For the first couple of months, right, month kind of 1 and 2, want to make sure that they get to some type of meeting in the first 2 months, whether it be a committee meeting or a full board meeting, and that they have a board buddy begin check-ins. Now, the board buddy program is basically a board mentorship program. It's some existing board member, ideally not the chair. So ideally, it's someone who isn't kind of a formal leader of the board, who they can just kind of check in with. This person will kind of check in with them every few weeks to see how they're doing, see if they have any questions. It's going to give them someone to connect with. So there's the social benefit of it. And it's going to give them an informal way for them to ask somebody like, hey, like, what are meetings like, right? Or I heard someone talking about this at the meeting. I had questions about it, but I didn't want to ask. So hopefully it gives them that kind of outlet to engage with. As we move into kind of 3 to 6 months, right? So they've been there for just a little bit now. We want to get them already into a committee and committed to some meaningful work. Now, a lot of times folks take this thing of, take the tack, they don't want to overwhelm a new board member. And definitely true, we don't want to, make them in charge of our event committee right off the bat. We do want to give them some meaningful work to do sooner than later, because ideally they joined the board because they wanted to do something. We want to still tap into that new energy they have. We haven't asked them for anything for a year and a half. By the time we actually come back to them and ask them to do something, they might have already kind of lost some of that drive, right? So we want to kind of get them there early so they get in a habit of thinking about the board being a place they actively participate. For the second half of the year, the board buddy program is going to phase out, right? Sometime between 6 and 12 months. They're going to continue to check in, though, maybe quarterly with either the board chair or the executive director, depending on how engaged your leadership is. And then finally, at the end of the first year, we'll do a little reflection activity with them, asking about what the first year is like, what they like to see differently, and beginning to prep them for thinking about future leadership roles, right, as either a committee leader or stepping on to exec in the future, at the end of year 2 or 3. So again, this whole model, and we dive much deeper into this in a board onboarding webinar, so I won't go too far here. I will just say again, the goal here is that from the very beginning, they're getting information, is transparently given to them, they feel supported, questions are answered, all the way through that kind of reflective moment after that first year where they really feel like they're a fully engaged board member at the end of the first year. The second tip we'll go over today is around an individual commitment form. So we see increasingly organizations have these. When we first started talking about these 4 or 5 years ago, we saw only about 25–30% of organizations having these. Now it's more about half. So still a long way to go. You may have one of these for your board. You may not. You may have it in theory, but don't really use it, which is a good chunk of folks as well. So when you think about an individual commitment form, what it is, this is an annual agreement that every board member would sign. It's largely the same for every board member. It's going to outline just major expectations, right? You're going to come to meetings, or you're going to come to this percentage of meetings. You're going to attend our annual fundraising event, if at all able. You're going to participate in stewardship opportunities, as able, right? You're going to be a good ambassador to the organization, et cetera, et cetera. So there's some high-level expectations for board members. The reason for this, and the reason we kind of put this out there, we'll talk about how to use this here in a second, is that the number one reason we see board and staff, have arguments or disappointments or challenges is different expectations, right? The board thinking they're going to be able to participate in a different way than they're being asked to, and staff thinking board are going to bring different resources than they do. So we want to make sure that both sides understand what the other one's getting into, what the other one's committing to, so they can prepare, right? Rarely do we see executive directors get upset necessarily by how much a board member gives. It's how much how that's a surprise, right? They said they were going to get 5K, they get 500. They said they're going to be at the meeting, they're not at the meeting. It's the surprise, right? That's often a challenge there. And same for board members. Board members thought I gave my 5K. Why are you asking me to make stewardship calls, right? Because they thought that by giving that, their kind of fundraising duties were over. So we want to make sure again expectations are set on either side equally, that they're known by both sides. That's going to get rid of a lot of the conflict we see with board and staff. It's going to allow for accountability. It makes the conversation at the end of the year, right? If we have a board member who's maybe less engaged, so we're thinking to this board culture we're trying to shift. We have a board member who isn't very engaged right now. We can go back to this commitment form and say, hey, you signed this last year, and let's go through this and see how much you really feel like you kind of lived up to it, right? It can be a natural kind of neutral starting place for a conversation about either re-engaging them or if this is the right time for them to be on the board. It helps to be a lot less personal, right? If we don't have a form like this in place, then it's just like, hey, I think you could do more. And they're like, well, I think I do enough, right? And that's a really tough conversation to have. Not that's going to be easy if you have a form in place, but it is going to be a little more neutral, a little less emotional, give you a little more of a leg to stand on as a board chair or ED, having those difficult conversations. And then finally, people ask a lot of times, do we put the financial expectation in there? If you do have a blanket give or get, we do recommend putting it in there. If you don't, and you have people kind of individually choose how much they're going to give, we encourage them to actually write that in and commit to that at the end of the year. So this can also be their pledge form for the year. And this is always the time that we make a little plug that we do see for a lot of reasons for board culture and engagement. Having people kind of choose how much they give instead of having a blanket give or get is something we recommend. Totally understand why a lot of organizations do the kind of blanket number. It makes planning a little bit easier as well. But we see a lot of times that either means we miss out on great board members who can't quite give at that level, but would be really engaged, right? It could really help our culture. Or we have board members who would give more, but because that's the give or get, don't feel kind of encouraged to or inspired to go beyond it. So often we see organizations shifting to, instead of one number, saying that your give or get to the organization has to be one of your top 3 philanthropic gifts, right, of the year. So we want to be a philanthropic priority for you. We don't need to be number 1 necessarily, but we need to be in the top 3. That might be $500 or $50,000, but either way, the priorities are equal. That prioritization kind of equalizing, we see as a good thing for culture, right? A lot of people know we're all equally invested in this, regardless of what the size of the actual monetary investment is. Third tip here is around agendas, right? So a lot of times we think about board meetings as something just to get through if you're on the staff side, right? And even if you're on the board leadership side, often it's something to try to manage through, right? Facilitate through. But they're really important as points of kind of culture and engagement and inflection points, right? If we think about the times we have the whole board together, an opportunity to really set and define what the culture is, and engagement, and how we interact with each other, and the norms we have, board meetings are by far the best time to do that, right? We may never at any other times get the board together. There's going to be individual committee meetings with subgroups of the board. Maybe we do a social each year. Maybe the board does an annual event each year. But generally speaking, board meetings are really the time that we see that culture play out, and also the chance for us to impact that culture as well. So some of the things we see in setting an agenda for a board meeting, if we want to drive that engaging culture a bit more with the organization, first is using a consent agenda. So what this is simply moving a lot of those items that we quickly vote on to something we expect board members to read ahead of time. We take a couple of quick questions on, then we move to vote and just move on, right, to real kind of conversation. So instead of having an agenda topic about approving the minutes, having an agenda topic about approving the finances, having an agenda topic about the executive director or program report, putting all that together, any other kind of just uh, business we have to do, putting it together, sending it out a week ahead of time in a packet, letting the board look at that, opening it up for any questions for 5-10 minutes at the very beginning. And once you get through those questions, so you might have one or two, moving to vote, approve it, and then move on. Again, the goal here is to save the majority of the meeting for more engaging conversations and move past this kind of transactional items pretty quickly. The majority of the meeting then, what you'll see here, the timing as it plays out, right, is in around major discussions, right? Board members theoretically join boards because they want to be strategic leaders, right? They want to be involved in the strategy and direction of the organization and making major choices. And this is the time to do that. So basically going through the meeting, right, we'd have that check-in consent agenda, as we mentioned, a mission moment, which I'll just briefly describe as something to connect board members back to why they care about the work. So it could be we go around the room and say why we joined the board. It could be that you're sending an article ahead of time you're asking them to read and you're going to discuss. But most time what it looks like is having a client or a staff member come and share an impact story, right? This is our frontline program staff. They're going to tell you something that happened this week that was really powerful. It's one of our clients. They're going to tell you how we've helped them, etc. But driving it home for the board about why the work matters so much. Some type of quick finance update. So usually in addition to kind of just the quick approval of the finances, we just want to give the board some type of really quick, here's where we're at in the year compared to where we're expected to be. And then again, the bulk majority of the time on 1 to 2 strategic conversations. So this could be, everything from program direction to development plans to this is where we put things like the budget, right, or things like that. But having those big kind of dense conversations. And finally, wrap up and votes at the end, and then some type of an executive session, which that is just board members meeting without the ex officios, without the EDs in the room. This is the best practice to do at every board meeting. It should be kept pretty short and sweet. This should not be a huge complain about the ED time or something, right? This is really just board members often checking in on their own goals, right? So if the board is doing a self-evaluation every year, this would be a good time for them checking on those goals, or asking anything they still have questions about, right? Like, hey, at the beginning of the meeting, we were talking about this. I forgot to ask. I have a question about it. And that's how we kind of usually want to structure that exec session. Finally, we're thinking about flow during the meeting. We're thinking about, we want to make sure, again, we're starting with that mission moment that's kind of high energy, high engagement, drive through consent agendas kind of quickly as we can, and really diving into the topics that matter and going most important topic first, right? So if we are going to do 2 or 3 topics, starting with the one that matters the most and where we know people care about the most. The 4th tip about how to get kind of broader engagement across the group and kind of shift that culture to not just 1 or 2 people kind of talking all the time, but everyone talking. One of these is we've seen some organizations really lean in to virtual board meetings, even as they've been able to bring their boards back in person, remaining virtual for at least some of their meetings, because they've actually seen greater board participation. Better attendance has been better for most organizations as the shift has been made to virtual board meetings. And we've heard anecdotally from folks that if facilitated well, actually more people are talking because it feels like less lower stakes to kind of speak up than it did in person per se. So thinking about how we use the chat actively during virtual meetings, kind of keep people engaged in the background, how we could use breakout rooms to have small group conversations that may or may not be possible in person, how we can share screens, right, make sure everyone's going through stuff at the same time. All of those can be used to drive participation in ways that we maybe wouldn't be able to do in person. This is in no way suggesting that all your board meetings moving forward should be virtual. I think what we're seeing though is people thinking about if I have 6 meetings a year are 2 or 3 of them virtual and 3 or 4 in person, or vice versa. So thinking about some of my meetings being virtual, some of them being in person. Regardless of virtual or in person, we really do see a real benefit during board meetings of having people meet in small groups at different times. So especially if we're going to pose a big question that we know there's going to be a lot of different opinions on, right? Should we go this direction or that? Having people talk about it in small groups first and then share out usually tempers some of those more kind of into the spectrum ideas, right? Because they've had to come together as a small group already. It engages everyone earlier, right? So everyone is saying something, so they're used to talking, so they're more likely to talk during the whole group conversation. And it's going to get some more diverse ideas out there, right? Instead of just one person saying something, then it's all kind of piling on to that. And then the other thing too, and again, this is true virtual or in person, but is especially important virtually, is delegating some of the sections. So it's not just the executive director and or the board chair talking constantly, right? So the goal is not that one person's kind of speaking the whole meeting. We have a board chair, and if they're not engaged in the executive director helping facilitate the meeting, move things along, right, stay on time, etc. But ideally, our committee chairs are actually running their individual sections, running a kind of in-depth conversation, right? And then getting board members to respond and talk during it. But we want to really prep speakers ahead of time and give some real ownership. Let the treasurer know that finance part really is those 10 minutes are up to them about how we use them, right? And you and the ED, you and the board chair are going to help them prep for it and definitely talk it through. We want to make sure that they're really owning that, so it's not just our voice the entire time. Committees. So we've seen committees really help with board culture because this is where work gets done on boards, right? So if we want to try to take that board from a culture of maybe less engagement, less kind of action, to more action and more things getting done, committees are a great way to kind of begin that process. It's really important we're thinking about how we get committees off to a good start. That launch of the committee is really important because just like with a new board member, if a committee launches and doesn't really do anything for the first 6 or 9 months, it's going to be really hard to get that committee re-engaged. So it's important we're launching those correctly. So a couple of things. They should be voted on by the board. The board should officially approve them, right? That's going to show the whole board's behind the idea of this committee. Most of them are going to be time-bound ad hoc committees, right, that exist for up to 12 months in most cases is usually kind of the northern limit, although it could be a little bit longer than that. Or it could be a long-standing committee, right? Governance committee that we expect to have forever, a fundraising committee we expect to have forever. We don't want to add too many of those long-standing committees because most of us have, on average, between 9 and 12 board members if you're a catalytic partner. Some of us obviously have more than that, so that's a little bit less. But since we already have an exec committee of probably 3 or 4 people, maybe governance and maybe finance, fundraising is the other kind of fourth one we see. But beyond those kind of 3 or 4, we often recommend things are ad hoc, so you're not stuck to a committee structure you don't have the people for long term. And then creating a committee charter. So this is basically bylaws for a committee, right? So taking your board bylaws in some ways kind of making them a lot cleaner and a lot simpler, but also more directed for just one individual committee. It's a one-page outline of kind of what they're doing. So it both highlights like their mission, right? This committee exists to do X, Y, or Z. The timeline for it, right? It will do X, Y, or Z over the next 3 or 4 months, 6 to 12 months, right? And this can be for an event you have coming up, right? It could be you're launching kind of an ad hoc DEI committee as you're looking to more center equity in your work or in your organization. It could be a million different things, right? But the charter is really going to help us stay focused on what the committee does, what the committee should be considering, and what its power kind of is. And then finally, getting some buy-in for this, right? So after the vote or even before the vote, meeting with board members to make sure there's some excitement about this, there's some people who plan to join, and trying to get that chair locked up pretty quickly. So either right before or right after the vote, you can say, and we plan on having X, Y, or Z person serve as the chair here. So I was talking about we often struggle coming up with substantive topics and work for our board. Any suggestions? Who should be setting the agenda? So ideally, the agenda process is that the executive directors come up with a draft of it. Right, here's the big things we'd like the board to talk about. Send it to the board chair. The board chair kind of weighs in, maybe makes some edits. Those two people kind of get on the same page, and then it goes to exec. Exec approves the agenda, right, with any edits they have. Then after exec and board chair and ED are all on the same page, then it goes to the full board for them to see ahead of time, so you know what the conversation is going to be. Now we know a lot of organizations struggle that engage board leadership, so it might just be ED led, but ideally it's ED drafted, but really board chair and exec council led in terms of sharing with the board. But again, that's an ideal practice. It may not be practical for everyone. Then in terms of topics, I'd really encourage, especially for the board meeting topics, to ask questions that you actually kind of care about the answer to, right? So one of those might be, do we have the right revenue mix, right? Are we getting our funding from diverse enough sources? If not, what should we be doing differently? Ideally, we have board members who both can give some advice there, but can also see themselves as part of the solution, right? Like, oh, it sounds like we're not getting enough individual donors. Maybe we need to tap into board networks to try to find more prospects, right? Again, for a lot of us, board engagement is enough of an issue that's probably an unlikely outcome of a conversation about that. But beginning to have those type of strategic conversations will make it more likely the board steps up and sees itself in that role. The final tip we'll cover today, I'll pause for other questions you all have, is about board evaluation. Really encouraging boards to evaluate themselves at least once a year. That evaluation usually takes two levels. One, a self-evaluation. So how did I do as a board member myself this year? And the second level of it is how do we do as a board collectively? So we can ask questions there about the culture, about the inclusivity. Do they feel empowered and engaged? How do they feel about the relationship with the ED? How do they feel about the meeting frequency, effectiveness, et cetera, et cetera. And that can give some really good information. That also is going to give us information that we can work with the board then to set goals for the board for the year moving forward. And ideally, we're timing this alongside the ED review. So we position it less as just the board's reviewing the ED and more as both sides of our leadership apparatus, right? The board and the executive director are getting evaluated annually. Based on those evaluations, are setting goals for themselves for the year ahead. And they're being held accountable to achieving those goals the next following year, right? And if we're doing that for the board and the executive director, it helps balance that power out a bit, and also ensures that both are developing. If you have an ED that just keeps developing on a stagnant board, you're not going to have that ED for very long, right? So it's really important that both are evaluating themselves and getting better and stronger over time. So with that, these are just a couple of kind of quick next steps here, but I want to pause for other questions folks have before we wrap up today. We have just another minute or two. All right. Well, great. Well, thank you all for joining. We'll send out the slides and recording shortly afterwards. And have a good rest of the day.